The sea smelled of resin and iron, like wet pine and the inside of a helm long left to rust. A slate sky lay low as a ceiling. The shuttered lantern at the stern of the hired galley swung in a long, slow arc, its little circle of honeyed light thrown onto ropes stiff with salt and hands red with cold. Wind slid unseen over the water and lifted the hair from John's brow, carrying the breath of Bear Island, sap and kelp and something wilderness-hard that he remembered without ever having known. He stood near the prow with his cloak tight around his shoulders and his gloved hands resting on the crossguard of the sword that had not left his side since a dying spring day in the Lord Commander's solar. The wolf's head hilt watched the horizon with garnet eyes. It flashed when the lantern swung and then went dark again, like a heartbeat. Ghost had sprawled at his boots, white fur gathering the blown spray and the glitter of it caught in his whiskers like hoarfrost. When the ship climbed a slow swell and the timber creaked, the dire wolf lifted his head and looked to John, as if to ask if the course was true. Behind them Davos Seaworth's voice came low and steady out of the gloom, as steady as a man speaking to the masts and the sea. "A shallow approach," he was telling the merman captain, "and no heroics in the shoals. You'll see lighted stakes where they want you to die. Give them a wide berth. Bear Island's boats have the same bite as their women." A gust laughed in the rigging. Tormund Giantsbane thumped along the deck like a moving barrel. "Women with bite," he said, sighing at the thought. "You Northmen hoard all the good tales. Bear wives, bear strong." He sniffed, shook melt from his beard. "I see no bears to wed, only trees that want to climb into the clouds. Best keep your tongue shorter than your sword here," Davos said, not turning, not unkind. "And you, Crow," Tormund said to John, "you sure their lady will not take your pretty blade as a bride price? A fine thing that would be, paying for a house with a sword and walking home with a stick and your C*CK between your legs. From your mouth to the god's ears," Davos muttered. John's gloved hands tightened and loosened on the crossguard. The wood under his boots slicked beneath his weight. The cold unspooled in him like a length of old rope. He had spoken the plan to Sansa in the candlelight below deck, and she had listened with her hands folded and her back straight, her eyes far older than her years. She had agreed without arguing, and that had given him less comfort than it ought. It had been easier when she argued. Return it, he told himself with the sea's rhythm. Return it and look them in the eye and tell them you were the sword's keeper, not its master. The old Bear's will had never been to make him lord of anything. Not lord of this blade, not lord of Bear Island, and surely not lord of Winterfell. Duty, the raven had croaked in the novice's voice of Maester Aemon. Duty and love had been the two sides of the same coin until he'd had to spend it. He had spent it at the wall, and the wall had asked for more until there was nothing left but scars and the thin, astonished silence that comes after death. Ghost leaned against his shin, solid as the ship's spine. The shore had come up from the mist as if the world were being sketched around them in charcoal. Black rocks and blacker pines and the bright shrug of surf, ice cracking where the water climbed the stone. The keep that huddled at the island's heart was built of wood as if it had grown there, as if it would go on growing long after any man remembered who had lifted the first beam. Carven bears stood sentinel at the great door. Their eyes had been rubbed smooth by countless hands. "Hold your breath," Tormund said, grinning. "It smells of honest folk. Might choke you." Sansa came up with her cloak puckered at the throat, her hair braided and coiled beneath her hood. When she saw the island, her breath whitened and disappeared. "It looks like the gods built it and the men forgot to ask permission. They are more likely to call the men fools for waiting," Davos said. "Hail now, and with your head high." John nodded. The lantern swung again. The wolf's eyes glowed and went out. The sword lay warm under his hands as something alive, as it always had, and he thought of Jeor Mormont's stiff hair and steady old hands and the way his eyes had softened when he'd spoken of his son. He remembered the sound the sword had made leaving the scabbard the first time it belonged to him. It had sounded like an oath cut clean. He lifted it now and the sound was the same. They were met in the courtyard by a line of Mormont men and women, leather and mail patched clean, axes held like extensions of their hands. Hard faces, hard lives, the old gods in their eyes. Alysanne Mormont stood a little ahead of the others, taller than most, her hair black with a thread of silver at one temple, though she was not yet old. She held a long axe as some men hold a child, with a perfect, easy certainty. Beside her, small as the blade's shadow, was the Lady of Bear Island, her cloak of snowy wolf stitched at the edges with silver thread, her face a study in fearless skepticism. "My lady," Jon said, stepping forward, the sword held before him in both hands. He had practiced these words in the dark, and still his mouth went dry. "Lyanna Mormont, I am Jon Snow, son of Eddard Stark, and I know who you are," she said. Her voice was a clear bell that did not need to be raised to be heard. "You are the crow who broke his oaths, the belly they call bastard, the boy the old bear sent south and who came back to find the men who stuck knives in him. No derision, only flatness. Judgment, the way cold is a judgment." Sansa's gloved fingers found Jon's forearm. A brief brush, as much assurance as she gave anyone now. "My lady," she said, and her courtesy had a spine in it. "I am Sansa Stark, and my name is Olderty, and any oath I swore or had broken for me. We come. We have your raven," Lyanna said. Her eyes slid to Sansa, measured and decided. Then to Jon again, and paused on the sword as if on a strange creature. "I asked you to come and stand before me and not hide behind ink. You have done that. Why is your sword naked in my yard?" "Because it is yours," Jon said. The words were a sword as well. The cold in him let go and left him hollowed, a cup held out. He dropped to one knee and lifted the blade up as if to a heart tree. The wolf's head watched the child's face and seemed to ask a question of its own. A murmur went along the line of Mormonts, not outrage, not surprise, but something like the noise water makes when it finds a new channel. "It was my grandsire's," Alysanne Mormont said, stepping closer. Her eyes were dark and alert, her mouth a grim line that might have learned to smile once and forgotten how. "He gave it to Lord Tyrant's son before Lord Tyrant had earned his name. He kept it when the shame came down. He gave it to the old bear when he put off his house and took the black. The old bear gave it to you when you saved his life." She nodded towards the wolf's head. "And had the pommel wrought with a wolf, a bear's sword with a wolf's face. I see the iron in the jest, Snow." "Do you?" "I do," Jon said, and meant it. "I have been its keeper, but not its master. There is no master for such a blade. It belongs to House Mormont, and I carry it only because Jeor Mormont put it in my hands. Now I come to return it to his home." "And buy our spears?" Lyanna asked. "Buy?" Jon shook his head. "You would not sell what your house is. The old bear knew that. I return what is yours and ask you to stand with a Stark, not to be bought. Winterfell is taken by a dog who flays men. He has my brother. He feeds the north to his fear. I have nothing to pay with save my blood, and that intends to be spent. This is no trade. This is an apology and a remembrance." Sansa's hood slid back so that her hair caught the gray light like a dull piece of copper. "We lost almost everything," she said quietly. "We are here to ask for what cannot be purchased." Lyanna came closer. She was very small. The wolf on her shoulders swallowed her hands. Her eyes never left Jon's face. "You were their brother who took an oath to be no one," she said. "Now you call yourself Stark again?" "I call myself what I was born," Jon said. "And I will take no lands and sit in no high chair if the gods bring us through. I will not be Lord of Winterfell." "What will you be?" Alysanne asked. "A son and a sword," Jon said. The admission cut clean and left him ground smooth. "If we live, this blade still ought to live where it was born. If we die, someone of your blood must lift it again when the night grows teeth. There's worse darkness than Ramsay Bolton. The old bear saw it. I have seen it. My oath was to fight that darkness. I broke it in letters and in leaving. I will not break it in truth." Alysanne studied him for a long breath. Lyanna looked down at the sword, touched the wolf's muzzle with a mittened finger. "It is ugly," she decided, "and pretty both, like the truth." Davos cleared his throat, stepped forward and bowed more out of habit than fear. "My lady," he said, "we're cold and courting frostbite. Your men know the wind better than I, but I've loved the sea longer. Bring us in and tear us to pieces if we're liars. And if we aren't, hear us near a fire." Lyanna's mouth twitched as if she would have liked to laugh if she had allowed herself. "Bring them in," she said to Alysanne. "Leave their boats under watch lest they breed without permission like rabbits." To Jon, "You may set the sword on my table. Do not touch it again until I bid you." He did as he was told, and in the Mormont hall the blade looked smaller laying on the wood stained black with bear grease and age. The hall smelled of smoke and roasted fish and the sweetness that hangs in a place often swept but never truly clean of old blood. Carvings of bears climbed the beams. Outside the long windows that let in cold light, the pines looked like an army standing at ease. They fed him and Sansa and their men hot broth with fatty meat and a thick heel of bread that steamed in the hand. Tormund soaked it all up with the unconcern of a man from a land where feasting might be the only feast he would see in a moon. Davos ate as if every swallow were a negotiation with his stomach. When the bowls had been taken and the hall had quieted, Alysanne came down the step to stand behind Lyanna. Men and women of Bear Island took their places along the walls like standing stones. "You shame us," Alysanne said, and the flatness of her voice was the only way a Mormont would let grief through. "Not you, boy, not for your returning. Our house is shamed by the son we made who sold men like sacks of oats and ran from the price. The old bear carried our name to the wall with honor enough to make up some part of it. He gave you our sword. I told myself more than once that was the last of it. I told myself steel was steel and honor was air. But you've put it in my head to think the old bear meant more by it. He meant to make us kin with men who do the hard thing." Jon had been cold, but he felt a heat in him that was not the fire. He did not speak. Lyanna lifted her chin. "You may tell me all your clever plans and all the names of all the houses which said your name and spat. I know them. House Glover says it has nothing left to give. House Serwyn has given up its walls to the dog. House Manderly smiles and counts how many crowns the sea brings without us. House Karstark has forgotten where it came from. House Umber, if they still have a house." Her mouth hardened. "We have our own list of the fallen. We bled with your brother and our sister bled with him and bled out at a wedding for it. We sent men to deep woods and to soft southern fields and did not bury most of them because there wasn't enough of them left to bury. Here we stand is what my house says. I have stood here until my legs will not stop shaking from it. You ask us to stand again. Why should we, and why should we stand with you?" Sansa rose before Jon could stand. "Because you are not standing with him," she said. She did not have to say his name. "Because standing alone is just a slower way of lying down. Because the child I was died on my wedding night, and if I do not stand now there will be no woman left either. Because my father believed you were kin, and fathers are fools sometimes and sometimes they are right, and they are dead too often to argue with." Lyanna listened, her face plain as a winter sky. "Do you speak for your house?" "I am what's left of it," Sansa said. Lyanna studied her, then flicked her eyes to Jon and back like a bird's. "I will give you what I have," she said at last. "I will give you men who are men and women who shoot better than the men. I will give you the sword for a night and for a day and for a year if that is what the darkness demands. Then the sword returns and you go where you must go. You are right about there being worse than Bolton. I can smell it on the wind. I have smelled it all my life." A smile like a cut came and went. "It is the smell of the north. But hear me, bastard. This is not a reward for your giving back what is ours. It is a recognition of an old debt your house laid on us with kindness. Our men fought for Robb and died. We remembered, even as we grieved. Your blade sits on my table tonight. Tomorrow our blacksmith will take a hammer to its pommel and make the bear's head again. If you carry it for us after that, you carry it as our arm and not as your keepsake. Do you understand?" "I do," Jon said. He did not trust himself to say more. That night he slept, if sleep it was, in a little loft under the rafters with Sansa in a chamber near the hearth guarded by women with axes. Ghost curled at the ladder's foot. It was not the sleep of boys or men, but a silvery drift where every breath had a shape that returned to him, and every shape was a tree. He dreamed he was beneath the heart tree in Winterfell, and the blood in the leaves was the same as in his throat. He dreamed the old bear's hand on his shoulder, warm even after death, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. He woke in the quiet that only comes after the worst, and the world was still there waiting to be paid for. They made a ceremony of it at dawn. The smith was a square old man with one eye and a thumb burned to a knob by some boyhood folly. He had a kiln that smoked sap instead of coal and made the air taste like old pine needles. The bear, they said about the pommel, was not polished and not pretty. It was a squat, honest thing with two flat ears. When the smith riveted it home, the sound ran down the blade and into Jon's bones. Alysanne lifted the sword and placed it in Lyanna's hands, and Lyanna held it for a long time as if weighing what it would cut. "Here we stand," she said. "Bear Island stands with the Starks who remember us and the North that remembers them. Jon Snow, bend your neck." He bent and felt the flat of Longclaw touch his hair. "You may carry this sword in our name," she said. "If I ask it back, you place it here on this table and keep your eyes forward. If I ask you to cut, you cut. If I ask you to drop it in the sea, you drop it and do not reach for it as it goes. Do you give me that word?" "I do," he said, because promises had to be made where oaths had been broken, and because his life had begun to feel like a rope of such promises, thin and strong and liable to burn a man to the bone if pulled too fast. Sansa watched him with that new expression she had learned in the last year. Something like surprise and something like pity and something like she was remembering a child she had read about in a book once. When he rose, she touched his arm again. They did not need words when they were standing beneath the same wind. They took the road that was not a road and was all the road Bear Island would ever have, over roots and ice-scabbed rock, and came to the little cove where the island's boats huddled on their props like sleeping seal pups. 200 Mormont fighters came down with them, oiled bows in their hands, spears as tall as men, axes with bare faces seared into the cheeks. They smelled of boiled leather and cold iron and pine pitch. The boats were clinker-built, tight as mussel shells, painted with pitch so black you could lose your eye looking at them. Davos clucked his tongue like a mother hen. "Fine work," he said to no one. "Light and fast and crabby in a crosswind. But no lady ever liked a man who didn't quarrel." "They'll like you well enough," Tormund said. "You look like they're kind. Easy to throw." They went first to Deepwood Motte, where the trees crowd so hard they sound like a sea in a gale even on a still day. The roads there had not forgotten the feet of Ironborn, and House Glover was nursing its wounds with a miser's grip. Lord Robert Glover met them in his hall with his hand white-knuckled on the chair arm, and his wife watched them with her mouth a line the gods had drawn and not allowed to curve since. They could have told him the story the way a lesser man would have liked, with flattery and the soft little lies about what could be expected and what would not be asked of him. They did not. Alysanne Mormont walked to the center of his floor and planted her long axe with a crack like lightning finding a tree. "I bled your floors," she said, "and I left men in your woods to fatten them when the snow fell. Some of those bones had names. When the Ironborn came, Bear Island sent me and mine to pull them from your keep by their hair. When the Flayer came, we were still burying our dead. My house was ruined," Robert said hoarsely. "My nephew hung. My sister married to a—" He did not finish. "What did your house do then, she? Bear? Did you write me a letter to say how sorry you were?" "No," Alysanne said. "We sent men to the young wolf. We sent women and boys with bows. We sent Daisy to die in a hall with music in it. And when that was done, we sent what was left of us to fight in the trees. We did not send letters." She looked at him, and her eyes were knives that had been whetted for years. "They come now with a sword that we forged and a name that we remember. You can sit in your ruin and order the sands in your hourglass and call every grain a hurt. Or you can take an axe and make more hurt for the men who handed you ruin. Robert Glover, I am tired. If you are more tired of pride than I am of grief, you will come." He did not answer at once, because a man's pride takes time to die, longer sometimes than his body. He looked to Sansa, and she did not say a word, and in the end he was a Northman, and the straight thing was the thing left to him. He stood. "You have the men I have," he said. And when he said it, he breathed for the first time like a man whose lungs remembered work. They sailed next to White Harbor because, though the road would have been easier on the foot, Davos said he trusted water more than dry land when men were watching, and John trusted Davos when water was laid before him. The merman's court was green and cold and monstrous handsome, and full of men who thought hard about ships before they thought about anything else at all. Lord Wyman Manderley was a mountain of man, and his voice was a shore the waves had polished smooth. "Lady Sansa," he said, and his face was light for a heartbeat as if remembering pies, and then shadowed again with the present. "Lord Snow, and I beg your pardon for not saying Stark because the truth is the truth until someone takes the time to wring it like a chicken's neck. I have no gifts for you save ships that mostly want to go where they want and food we cannot afford to lose. I have sons." The free folk were a noise all their own, laughter and oaths and 100 different ways to hold a spear wrong that Tormund shouted them out of by beating their shoulders with the flat of his own. Small bands from Serwyn and from a dozen little holdings that had never sent more than a few men to any fight came threading in like creeks joining a river. Over them all the banners in the bitter air did what banners have always done, reminded men of things too big to carry otherwise. From Winterfell came no banner but the bastards' hounds and the bastards' men. Where the fields lay flat they had built their strange circles and their high walls of stakes. Scouts said Ramsay had more horse than the wind, more archers than a half-dozen holds could have spared and smiled about it, more pikes than prayer. His allies made him larger. The Karstarks with their cold pride, the Umbers with their wide hands and their small eyes and their own pride which had twisted smaller and meaner. Somewhere behind his men there was a boy the Starks had lost and the North had lost and the gods had lost because the gods do that too. Sansa spoke as the morning grew a little less gray. She spoke first to Jon and then, when he asked her to the men around the fire. "He will try to right the battle before we arrive," she said. "He will make you come to him. He will put my brother in front of a line and cut his throat when you run. He will make you run. You cannot help but run." Her voice did not tremble when she spoke it. She looked at Jon. "You cannot let him make your heart tell your feet what to do. If you love Rickon, you cannot ride at him. You have to let my brother die or the rest of us will." It sat in the air between them. Tormund looked down at the toes of his boots. Alysanne only nodded once, a motion as small as the twitch of a cat's ear. Davos's mouth thinned. Robert Glover crossed himself with fingers that had done it many times. Jon felt the old ache flare like a star. The boy who had wanted to be his father had always thought love saved things. He had learned since that love had teeth and two, bigger bites than any hunger. "If he brings Rickon," he said hoarsely, "we do not move." "He will bring Rickon," Sansa said. "Hear me, Jon. I know him. He will bring him and he will throw him if you do not run. Do not run." The cold in Jon's blood found a shape and froze there. He nodded. They built their own wall of stakes, but not to hide behind. Cheval de frise with teeth pointed outward, ugly twisting things that would break a horse's legs, with little openings between them that only a single man could pass. Davos walked it with a tinker's care, kicking at each stake until it was sure, tugging each rope until it sang the right note. "If he wants to lance you," he said, "let him lance a hedge, and if he wants to choke you, give him something to choke on that's wood, not your throats." Alysanne strung her archers where the ground dipped just slightly, so that a man charging would not see the bowstrings until he felt the wind from them. "Loose soft," she said, "and loose together. If your fingers itch, scratch them on your own arse." The Mormont women smiled at that with their quick white teeth and said nothing. They had the look of children whose parents had never told them stories where wolves were tamed. Ghost paced the line with Jon like a white old spirit. Sansa held a horse's rein most of the day and did not mount, and when Jon spoke to her he knew she was there because sometimes her eyes moved from one thing to another. Davos made sure the reserve had wood for fire and the boys had something in their stomachs that was not fear. Tormund painted something on his shield that he claimed was a bear and looked like a drunk's map of a woman's face. The Glover men tightened their grips and the free folk told each other dirty jokes and then fell silent when they remembered no one would want those jokes tomorrow if they lost. Snow began toward dusk, the small dry kind that looks like ash on a cold hearth. It stitched the day together. The night fell like a thick cloak, and with it came the noises of horses breathing steam, leather creaking, 1,000 small sounds that together were more than sound. John tried to sleep in a tent that was only a suggestion of walls. He dreamed of the old bear again. The hand was warm and heavy. When he woke, it was dawn. Ramsay Bolton sent a boy with a white flag and words like knives glinting. John sent the boy back with nothing but the same flag and the words that had attached to him since he'd been a child: Stark, Snow, traitor, son. The bastard needed words the way other men needed meat. John would not feed him. They dressed the ground with blood and iron before the sun had decided whether or not to rise. Ramsay did what Sansa had said he would, because men like Ramsay do what they are always going to do, and will until the day some hand makes them stop. He had Rickon walked out between two guards with ropes around his wrists and a strip of cloth around his eyes. John could see him across the field, a shape that was both small and the whole of the world. He did not move. His hands closed on Longclaw without lifting it. Ramsay spoke to the boy and cut the rope at his wrists. He pulled the blindfold aside and smiled the smile of a man who watches ants burn. He pointed to John with his knife. Then he turned Rickon by the shoulders and shoved him in the direction of the stakes and the hedge and the boys and men who loved him. Rickon ran. He ran the way children run when they do not know that there is a thing behind them that is not rain. He ran crooked because he had not been taught to run straight when someone is shooting at you. He fell once and rose and ran again. Archers behind Ramsay lifted and lowered, lifted and lowered. The play of it was in their shoulders and not their eyes. Ramsay took a bow for himself and laughed. He drew and held and let. An arrow walked the field. It did not find Rickon. John's heart turned like a wheel and he felt the axle try to break. He had a horse waiting. He stood there unmoving. He did not ride. He did not move his feet. Sansa's hand was on his wrist. He did not remember her moving to him, but there she was. Her fingers were iron. The second arrow went wide. The third kissed the boy's sleeve and nicked him so that his head snapped, and then he ran on. The fourth would have taken him in the throat if the gods had smiled or had teeth. It took him in the back instead, mid-spine, and he went down like a field of wheat in wind. The sound that came then did not come from John. It came from the men all around. It came from the women in the Mormont line, a soft hiss like something emptying. It came from Tormund, whose curse shook the frost off the heather, and from Davos, whose breath stopped for the space of 3 heartbeats and started again a different thing. John did not move forward. He saw Rickon's hand claw once and the snow dig under the nails and the breath leave him like steam. Ramsay raised a gloved hand, a puppet master with no need of strings, and the first charges began. They came like a brown flood, axes high, shields low, the pitiless logic of men who had learned to fight where mouths were more prized than throats. The Karstark's banners were like cracks in ice. The umbers were fat and red with meat. John did not give the word. Davos did, because he could count men in motion and would with teeth the way other men counted coins. And because John had not asked to lead with his mouth. The archers on the first line raised. The string hum filled the air like bees, and the first flight fell into the muddy snow with the sound of meat thrown on a table. Ramsay's men hit stakes and found out the difference between men and trees. Horses reared and fell screaming. Men tried to climb between the gaps and met spears there, short and ugly and built to be loved by people who hate the people in front of them. The free folk gave ground in the way they always did, like water spilling around stones until the stones were under them and the men on top were drowning. Tormund's laugh and roar and curse were one sound that made John laugh and hate himself for it with the same breath. Alisane Mormont's archers loosed in sheets, scythed men down where they bunched and then loosed again. When the arrow barrels were gone, the women took up spears and went to the gaps and stood in them. John's job was not to kill. He found that out with the second wave. His job was to be seen by both sides. He was urgent and ordinary in their eyes, a man with a sword he had promised away, a promise kept for now by keeping it in his hand. He did not think the sword dragged differently with the bear on its hilt. It was still a length of history that had found a use. When he cut a man who had his mouth open to shout, and when he parried another whose breath stank, he did not think about the old stories of Valyrian steel. The stories took care of themselves with a thin, song-like keen running along his forearms when the blade bit true. That was all. That and the little push he felt when the world and his body moved together like oiled gears. Ramsay sent cavalry where Davos had put ditches where the fog was thickest and arrows where Alisane's women had left their quivers and taken up their spears. He sent men to the flanks where Robert Glover stood like a wall. When they stumbled into the holes and broke their wrists and screamed, the men behind them pushed them forward as if their bodies were planks of a bridge. When Ramsay saw the hedge would not break the way his mind had written it breaking, he began to draw them into the circle where the bastard liked to close his hand and squeeze men until their breath came out like paste. Jon saw it begin at the edge where the umbers roared and the flayed man banners settled and the ground began to roll under men's feet like a rug being pulled. The shield wall tightened around the free folk, around Alisane's women, around the boys from Serwyn and the men from Deepwood, and the air went away. Davos shouted and waved, and the reserves pressed, and the hedge of stakes bent but did not break. "Hold, you bastards!" Tormund cried, laughing and spitting blood and teeth together. "Hold for your mothers and their fine arses." It is a curious thing to watch a battle become what it wants to be. On a map it looks like a spill of ink. In the mouth it tastes like salt. It becomes what the strongest imagination in it is. Sometimes that is a man's and sometimes it is fear. The circle began to close. The shield edges met and men crushed up like or in a smelter. A Glover man near Jon dropped to his knees and disappeared like a stone tossed into a deep well. Ghost went up on his hind legs and clawed a man's throat out and dropped back like a cat into the snow. His fur was red up to his belly. Jon took a step and then another and found himself without space to take a third. He lifted Longclaw and there was no room to swing it. He thought, stupidly, of the old bear's raven croaking corn and king, as if there were anything simple left in the world. Then trumpets came out of the hills like birds. The sound became a wave with no water and the men in the circle flinched like men who hear thunder in a clear sky. Jon could not see the riders, but he felt the ground start to talk under his feet. He felt the circle that was closing pause and then yield like a hand that opens because it is forced. The veil came cold and bright and full of the old arrogance that thinks it will never bleed. Littlefinger's banners were neat and the men under them were neat and their spears were long and their mouths were set and their horses piss-proud. They hit Ramsay's flank with the weight of all the mountains stacked on them and for a moment both armies made a sound like the world cracking. Sansa had gone cold as iron when she had written the letter. She stood now on a low rise with a Glover boy whose arm had been torn and knotted, and she watched the Knights of the Vale ride in with her face a pale shield. They were not hers, not really. Neither was this snow. But she had been iron when there had been nothing left to be. She did not cry when the Vale crushed down on the Bolton men. She did not smile when men who had made songs of her fear died. The circle opened. Air returned like a favor. Alisane barked a laugh whose sound could cut wood and shoved forward. Her long axe had not grown heavier. It had only learned her hands better. She found Lord Harold Karstark in the press by accident or fate, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. He had his father's hard mouth and his house's betrayal still like ash on his collar. She stepped and swung once, and all the pretty points of his beard were red. He fell like a hard-felled tree. "For Daisy," she said. And then the crowd swallowed her again. Jon came out of the gap the same moment 3 umbers made for him like fishermen who had spotted some slow-moving wealth. The first had the face of a young man who had grown up too strong and too hungry. His mouth was a child's mouth despite the beard. Jon met his axe with the flat of Longclaw. The cut shivered down his arms. He turned his wrist and slid the point under the boy's beard and up, and there was nothing left to do about that. The second umber's shield caught Longclaw and held it, and that would have been the end of the story except Ghost saw something it did not like and took the man's hand at the wrist with a sound like fruit being torn. The third stood blinking blood out of his eyes until the world made sense again, and then saw Ramsay riding backward like a man drawn by a string. "Don't chase," Davos shouted from somewhere a little higher than the ground, clinging to a broken stake and pointing with a sword that had lost half its guard. "Hold your feet, you fools! Hold your feet and let the river run!" They held. The river ran. It ran right over Ramsay Bolton's back and into Winterfell with him ahead of it like flotsam. Men who had been content to eat meat off men drew back from the Vale charge and the bears and the free folk and thought about their homes and their children and remembered everything at once. And they broke. Even men like that break. The flight was not elegant and it was not long. The gates of Winterfell swung, not wide, but just wide enough to admit a man at a gallop with 3 behind him. It would have been enough if the gate had not swung the other way then with a groan like a man who has been sitting too long. It had been taken by more than one kind of treachery, that keep. There are debts we pay when we haven't meant to owe them. When Jon crossed the yard, the snow had not yet settled over the men who had fallen there in the storm before. He did not know what he was. He went after what he hated. He found Ramsay in the kennel with the hounds whining and the shit stink and the rushes rotting. He found him with a bow and the smile still on his face and the dogs making small sounds like dreams. They did not exchange many words because words were the way the boy played. Jon did not play anymore. He moved as the dogs rose, then as Ramsay drew, then as a man who is tired moves when tired is the end of everything. He lifted Longclaw and cut the arrow out of the air without thinking whether that was a thing a man could do. He crossed the distance. He only stopped when Sansa stepped into the mouth of the kennel, and her face made the shape of the end of it. "Leave him," she said, her voice low and unhurried. "Leave him to me." Jon looked at the man who had taken his brother and his home. He looked at his sister, who had lost brother and home and more. He put Longclaw point down and stood it in the trampled rushes so that it hummed a little. "He is yours," he said. She did not smile. She did not look at Jon again while she did what she did. He stood outside under the eaves of the kennel and listened to the dogs at their work and thought of the way love has teeth and no eyes. Ghost leaned into him and the snow fell in the yard and the wind turned, swinging in from the north. Men's voices filled the great hall at Winterfell like smoke. The banners came down and went up, the old direwolf on the long trestle again, the Mormont bear settling under it as if it had been traveling a long distance and had at last remembered the shape of its bed. Alysanne Mormont stood with her hair sweat-damp and a cut on her cheek and looked as far from smiling as a man dying looks from laughter. Robert Glover wept. Some men take names they did not expect to carry and carry them until their backs are bent with it and their knees are gone. There is a man here who was a boy, who was a bastard, who was a crow, who was a corpse, who came back and did not go south to be kissed but went north and kept going. He brought a sword home that was not his and put it on my table and asked me to decide if he was a man. I decided. The North has decided now. I say that man is the man I will follow while the snow falls, and when the snow stops, if it ever does. Her small hand lifted, and the room listened more closely as if she had pulled the air taut. I may be a girl in your Southron stories.
Iama Mormont in mine.
The boy who is a man is Jon Snow. The king that matters is the king in the north. I will stand with him until my legs forget how. Jon could have told them they were wrong. He thought of doing it. He thought of telling them the truth, about where he had gone when he died and whether there had been anything there, about how empty he had been when he came back, about how there was a quiet in him now that might never leave. He thought of Sansa, who watched him with her hands closed and her mouth soft and hard at once, and of Davos, who had learned a long time ago that men who say no to crowns sometimes have to say yes to worse things. He thought of Alysanne, who had put the bear back on a sword and handed it to him because she liked the way he had looked on his knees. He thought of the old bear, who had not asked him what he wanted to be. He heard the sound men make when they remember themselves. He heard Tormund's laugh barked out like a slap, and Robert Glover's boots hitting the floor, and the free folks' rough voices learning how to say king without spitting. He heard Sansa say nothing and say everything, and he heard the wind under the eaves drawing the smoke out and sending it up to the gods. He took Longclaw from where he had leaned it by the hearth. He set it on the table again and stood back. The bear on the pommel looked up at him with no welcome and no reproach, exactly as it should. "This sword is not mine," he said. "A king's first act should not be a lie he tells himself to make him feel better. I carry it for Bear Island until Bear Island asks for it back. I carry it because the old bear had a mind for what kind of men can be born from boys. I will carry it as long as there is need and no longer. If you want a king, you will have to make me one with your work and your hunger and your forgiving. I will not be a king because a room is loud. If he had thought they would quiet then, he was wrong. They were louder. Later the hall emptied as all such rooms do when the wine is gone and the legs are tired. Fires burned low. The wolves slept. Davos found John in the godswood, sitting in the crusted snow beneath the heart tree with the sword across his knees. The heart tree's face was old and familiar and did not look at them at all. I keep finding you at trees, Davos said, lowering himself down with a grunt. A habit like mine for waking up soar everywhere. John did not look up. I thought I would feel something, he said. When men shout your name, when a child gives you a thing you did not ask for. After the battle, after the everything. He made a small noise, not a laugh. I feel like a man who went out into the snow at night and woke up as the fire was going out and no one would give him a blanket. Davos said, that's closer to the truth than most men ever know. He rubbed his hands together and looked up at the red leaves quivering. You did right about the sword. Men care about these things. Not all men. Enough. I will sleep easier knowing the bear sits on your hand if you ever have to swing at something with blue eyes. John's fingers tightened on the crossguard. The dead are coming, he said. Ramsay was just a hill. The mountains, they're still. Mountains don't move, Davos said, but men have found ways through them. Through them, John said and laughed softly once. They sat there until the cold asked them to move. Sansa came to them with snow in her hair that had decided it liked it there better than warmth. She knelt across the sword and looked at it as if it might tell her something. I was cruel to you, she said to John without looking at him. I said you did not know him, and you didn't, and I didn't know how much I was asking. I needed to hear it, John said. She nodded, then reached out as if to touch the pommel and withdrew her hand. Lyanna was right, she said. We must decide what men are when we are girls. In the days that followed, the hall filled and emptied, and the rooms that had dogs in them had men with lances for a while, and the kitchens were never cold, and the walls felt less like walls and more like something breathing. Raven feathers collected in a basket by the sept and by the heart tree and were counted and parceled and sent with the quick hands that had learned the routes of the sky by rote. Wyman Manderley sent grain that arrived with men who'd eaten half of it on the way for the good of their souls. Robert Glover sent carpenters. The Serwyn boys learned to make the gaps in the hedge of stakes wide enough for a man with a limp to squeeze through. Alysanne sent her younger niece to fetch back a band of hunters who'd gone north beyond the bear's teeth and never come back. The girl brought most of them and a new scar and did not tell anyone how, and no one asked. John did the work they brought him, which was mostly listening and sometimes deciding. He learned that the way to become the man they said he was to listen twice as much as you wanted and speak half as often as they needed. He ate when Sansa told him to, because the times he did not, she looked at him like a mother fox looks at a kit that has wandered too far toward the traps. He slept when he could. He walked the walls when he could not. He stood between the carved kings in the crypts of Winterfell and put his hand on his father's stone knee and did not cry. He found himself watching the door with the part of him that was still a crow, waiting for something to come through that would make everything simple. Nothing did. Lyanna did not smile again, not that anyone saw. She watched the men drilling and the women fletching and the boys stringing bows that were a little too much for their hands. Once she looked up at John as she passed and gave him a single short nod, exactly as if he had done something small right. A raven came from the wall with the cold in its feathers and the smell of old stones and a note that said only, "We see them." John took it to Sansa and to Davos and to Alysanne, and all three of them read it with their eyes and the space between their ribs and did not waste time with words. "When?" Sansa asked. "Soon," John said. "Soon enough that men who do not want to believe will still be saying no when they're in the yard." "I should send the girl to the lords who have not found their pride," Alysanne said. She meant Lyanna, and John saw the nod Sansa gave and the way the girl shook her head without being asked. "I will go where I please," Lyanna said without anger, "but not to beg men who have already told me no to tell me yes. We will spend the breath on the ones who have nothing left to do but be brave." The first of the dead came into their world like the first flake in a snowfall no one had believed the old men about. A hunter brought a story of a cousin who had not stopped walking even when the hole in his chest had filled with water. A shepherd woke to find his flock had stopped making noise because there was no flock left. Then there were footprints on the outer wall, not as if something had climbed, but as if the wall had leaned to look and pressed its face into the snow. John took Longclaw to the smith and asked for the tang to be checked and the hilt bound with leather that would not slip in a cold, wet hand. He stood while the old man worked in. Dee listened to the sound of hammer on something else, and the rhythm went through him like a second heartbeat. When he went out, the air had a new taste in it. He lifted his face to it. It tasted like the pause in a story before someone says something they will wish they had swallowed. "I suppose this is when a king gives a speech," he said to no one, and then Alisane was there because the gods love a dramatist and she had heard him. "You aren't the king because of your speeches," she said. "Save your breath." "Useful counsel," Davos said, coming up behind her with a scarf that had not kept his nose from going red. "The men need to see you sharpen your sword and eat bread and sleep. They do not need you to talk. Talking's for the living. They'll get back to it when they can." Sansa came with a roll of parchment at her hip, and when she smiled at them it was a smile a woman makes when she is proud of a child and something else that is not pride and is not simple. "My mother used to say speeches are for weddings and funerals," she said. "I suppose we've had both." They moved before any more ravens came to tell them things they could smell and see and hear. The frost crept. The roads turned to ice's memory. The trees were white to the first branch. They set men on the lower walls and the outer farms. They put women with bows in the towers where the wind moaned through the arrow slits like songs. Children were sent to the crypts with candles, and the old were sent with them, which comforted none of the old and angered some of the children. The first skirmish was small and very loud. Men ran to it and turned back from it, and afterward each man had a different story of how many of them there had been and how they had moved and who had killed what. Ghost had blood on him that steamed and did not smell like any blood John had smelled before. Longclaw made the sound it had never made in any fight against men. A thin keening that went on after the blade had finished cutting, as if the steel had learned a new thing and was trying to say it out loud. John did not sleep that night. He did not remember if he had ever slept. Ever. In the God's Wood the heart tree kept its counsel. John spoke to it anyway. "I told them I would not be king because a room was loud," he said. "Now I will not be king because the world is loud." The snow on the red leaves did not shift. He thought of the first time he had held Longclaw and how surprised he had been to find something in the world that felt exactly like the thing it looked like. "When this is done," he said to the face with the sap tears, "I will take this sword and lay it on the table at Bear Island. I will tell the girl thank you for letting me borrow it. I will tell the bear to watch someone else's hand while they sleep." He lowered his head then, and the cold held it there, and the tree watched him not at all. Lyanna found him there later and stood beside him with her hands tucked into her sleeves. She did not look at him, and he did not look at her. "When this is done," she said, "I will find the woman who tells the stories to the children and teach her not to lie about what is brave." He nodded. It was all there was. Days became the kind of time men measure in heartbeats and in footsteps. Scouts disappeared and some came back. Men learned to keep their voices low without hushed commands because the sound of their voices came back wrong from the snow like the echo of a man calling down a well. Longclaw found things to cut that were cold and screamed without breathing. Alisane took a wound along the ribs and bound it herself with a piece of a dress and told her niece she would find a better cloth if she had cared enough to wear one and smiled to show it did not hurt when it did. Davos saved 2 boys from being taken through a door by the thing that was in the door. Tormund got very drunk once and woke very sober and whispered to Jon that he would prefer to fight men. Robert Glover slept with his boots on like all the stories said brave men did and woke with his feet cramped so badly he stood weeping on them, his fists in his eyes, and then he laughed because he could not bear not to. Sansa took over the rationing in a way that made old kitchen women shake their heads and obey. She stood on the rampart one morning with snow clotted in the corners of her mouth and looked at the world like a ledger. "We can do this," she said. "We can do this if no one lies." "No one will," Jon said. "They will," she answered. and her mouth softened grimly. "But I will make their lies smaller by the time they say them." The dead pressed in. They pressed in at night and at gray noon and at the hour when men think of soups, and they pressed in a way that made men remember how the world had seemed when they were children, large and not interested in your name. The living moved as Alysanne told them, as Davos directed them, as Jon asked them. There were names, and they were said over bodies and whispers, and there were smaller names that were said into the teeth of things that were not as cold as they should have been. Men who had never thought to fight beside women did, and boys who had never thought to see their mothers killed did, and all of them forgot the stories in their heads and learned the ones their bodies were telling. In the second week, a woman with a bow who had never missed once did miss, and the thing that climbed out of the arrow's shade took her and nearly took the boy who loaded for her, and Alysanne, who had been far enough away to do nothing but shout, did not shout and did not weep. Later she found the boy asleep by the hearth and touched his hair once and walked on because there was no room in her for that. Not then. Nothing in a story lasts forever, including the worst parts. The first day that the sun showed itself like something behind a sheet, the dead slipped back toward where they had come. The second day they tasted a rout and did not appreciate it, and the third day men laughed, and the laughter sounded like men. The living do not stop because they win. They mend. They try to remember how to stand in a room without looking at the windows. They count themselves by counting the empty spaces. The North remembered as it does. It remembered the dead, which is its pride, and it remembered to feed those who had to live, which is more admirable. When it was as done as anything gets done, Jon took Longclaw down from the hook Sansa had told him should be there over his bed to remind him to sleep, and put it on his back. Davos saw him on the steps. "Going to leave quietly?" Davos asked. "You give away swords better than you take a crown." "It was never mine," Jon said. He put a hand on the bear's head, and it did not feel like judgment in his palm, only stubbornness. "It was borrowed. If we have to borrow it again, we will." Davos said. "We'll borrow everything, even hope if we must." They went together to the stables, where Ghost lay sprawled with his nose at the door, as if he knew already where they were headed. Sansa came out of the stable and put her hand on Ghost's head, and the direwolf closed his eyes. She looked at Jon and then at Davos and then at the sky. "I could come," she said. "You could," Jon said. "But then there would be no one to make the lies smaller." "You should not make your jokes," she said, but her mouth remembered how. "Go then. Come back before the men remember any other songs." He touched her cheek, once. It felt like a coin he had not expected to spend but had found was the exact price for something he had to buy. Bear Island looked the way it had the first day, the water grayer and the pines more black and the wind the same old uninterested thing. The hall smelled the same, and the bears on the door were the same and had had their eyes rubbed even smoother. Lyanna was taller by something that might have been winter or might have been the way a person grows when they decide not to fall. Jon did not speak until the sword lay on the table again with the black wood under it taking the shape of it as if it had been waiting. Alysanne stood behind Lyanna with her hands on the long axe and her hair bound in a leather thong that looked like it could cut on its own. "We borrowed it," Jon said. "We're here to return it. You can ask us for it again if we live long enough to need it again." Lyanna put her hand on the pommel. She looked at him and at Davos and then at Ghost, whose tongue lolled in the cold the way a child's hand hangs out a window and plays with the wind. She nodded once, the same cat's ear twitch as before. "We do things this way," she said. "We lend and take back. We remember we gave and we remember we got. We do not pretend." Alysanne reached out and pushed the sword a little so that it caught the light. "It looks better now it is ugly properly," she decided. "Every time a man did a thing he shouldn't with it." The bear sulked. Lyanna lifted the sword with both hands and handed it hilt first to Jon again. He felt his mouth open, then he shut it. "For the night," she said, as if she were granting him a cup of water. "For the day, for the year you spoke of, and for the breath beyond it. You return it when I say. You do not argue with me when I say. I am the one who will decide when the bear has had enough again. Meanwhile, use it. Things are not done coming out of the dark. Do not stand there looking like a man who has been given 2 mothers and told to choose. You will make us think you are soft. We prefer you hard." Alisane snorted once and then didn't laugh. You came to return a sword and to turn the river so it ran a different way, she said. You did one thing. The other will take the rest of your life. She put her hand on his shoulder, a weight heavier than he had thought her hand would be. It's good work. Get to it. On the way back to the boats, Davos said, I thought you were going to be rid of the damned thing. John smiled, finally, as the wind stole his breath and gave it back. So did I, he said. He looked down at Ghost, who trotted with the unconcern of something that had seen too much to worry about small human plans. I should have known better. You should, Davos said. But there's a first time for everything. They stood a long while at the shore, every man with his own thoughts and the sea telling its one story, over and over, about coming in and going out, about giving and taking, and never pretending they were the same thing. Longclaw's weight rode John's shoulder like an old friend trying to teach a new way to walk. He thought of Lionna's small hand on the bear's head and of Alisane's voice and of Sansa's ledger and of the old bear's warm hand that was not warm anymore and of the men who had died in a field because he had taught himself to watch and wait. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the North's heart was a large thing with many rooms. He did not say any of it out loud. He lifted his face into the salt and the cold, and the ship's lantern swung, and the wolf's eyes and the bear's head shone and went dark and shone again, like two old truths in a world that hadn't grown any kinder. He stepped aboard with the men who had decided to love him enough to make him better than he was. He set his hand on the rail as the boats pushed off, and Bear Island moved away as all true homes do. Slowly, stubbornly, promising to be there when you came back and offering no forgiveness if you did not. The sea curled under the bow and the pines on shore stitched themselves into a single line, and the wind from the north wrapped them all. Ghost licked salt from John's fingers and looked out at the gray. Far ahead, somewhere under that same wind, Winterfell waited with its old stones and new ghosts, and beyond that the edge of the map where the words dwindled and the drawings stopped. It was a good road if a man liked his roads honest. Jon Snow breathed deep, and the cold went into him and came out again warmer than when it had gone in. He put his hand on the sword's hilt, and it did not seem to mind. He had work to do that would never be done, and men and women who would stand where they said they would stand with him, and a sister who would tell him when he was a fool, and a friend who would make him eat. The sky was iron. The world was indifferent. The boat moved. The wolf smiled in the way wolves smile, all teeth and trust. The bear on the hilt rode the rise and fall without comment. They went.